Herald van Linde.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I've worked on this book for 3.5 years, so it's always a pleasure to talk about it. So we're going to talk about Majapahit. I actually started to write about Indonesian history, about the history of Jakarta a couple of years ago. And then I started later on with Majapahit. I got into writing and I got into history. And I asked my colleagues in Hong Kong. So I live and work in Hong Kong. I work for a bank called HSBC. I'm a regional equity strategist, so look at stock markets completely different. But we have a department of about 80, 90 people, all very well educated, have been in Asia for an awful long time, some of them 30, 40 years. If not, they don't come from the region. So I asked them around what they knew about Majapahit. The Indian said it's wrong. It's called Mahapajit because that's the Indian way of how words would work. Maha is great. Pajit, they have no idea what it is. Somebody else proposed that maybe Majapahit was a cookie, an Indonesian cookie or cake or something, like pandan, but then Majapahit, something like that. So the knowledge about Indonesian history is extremely limited. Actually, I would say the knowledge about Indonesia on and beyond its history, just about the country, is actually limited. If I read the FT every day, China is in there, the US is in there, the UK is in there, India is in there, Indonesia is very seldom in there. It's a fascinating place that needs to be introduced, and hopefully with a bit of history we can do so. So why did I write a book about Majapahit? It wasn't just to educate my colleagues. It actually started here in Bali for me. On the 1st of August 1990, I was a backpacker, came here, stayed in Ubud in some Losmen Chandri, I don't even know really where it is, and took a boat to Lombok afterwards, after maybe being here for 10 days or something. And on the boat, there was a young girl. I was 20, she's 8 at the time, and she was sick. So I gave her some medication, just aspirin, thought maybe helped. And the parents came over and we started to chat, and they spoke Indonesian, not English. I couldn't speak Indonesian. So there you go. We couldn't really communicate. Afterwards, when I left the boat in Lombok, they were picked up by family. They said, why did you come with us? Where do you want to go? I wanted to go to the Gili Islands. They said, well, you come with us first. So I had a lunch. And then they said, why did you stay for dinner as well? And actually, we got a place to stay. And Indonesians are incredibly hospitable people. I stayed for them for 3 days. And then they said, if you're in Jakarta, come over and give us a call. So 2-3 months later, I was in Jakarta. I stayed in Jalan Jaksa, where all backpackers stayed. Still stay, I presume. And called them, and they say, why have you checked into some sort of cheap Losmen? We'll pick you up. So I stayed with them, and I can speak out loud as well. I stayed with them, and initially 1 day, then 2 days, and eventually 6 months. And I made a deal with them that I had no money. So I said, listen, I can stay with you, but I can't pay with you. These people were not very rich. They lived in southern Jakarta, Pasar Minggu, had no car. So I made a deal with them. I teach your daughter English, but you teach me Indonesian. So I learned Indonesian from a early stage in that sense. And I would say ucapkan terima kasih kepada Usara juga di bahasa Indonesia bahwa ya saya telah diundang di sini untuk bicara mengenai sejarah Majapahit. So I'm very happy with that. So I started to hear, living there in Pasar Minggu with that family, I started to hear stories about Indonesia and Majapahit a little bit as well. And eventually, for me to understand a nation, it's about its food, it's about its language, but it's also about its history. So for me, it was a sort of a discovery project as well to understand Indonesia when I started to work on Majapahit. And when I started to work on it, my wife said, okay, it's very nice you do that, but Indonesians are not interested in history. And so far, I've met one Indonesian in the last 1.5 years, and I've done a lot of talks all over Java as well, who said, I always liked history. There's a lot of people interested in history, but at school, it is taught in such a way that most people are very much offset by it. They think it's incredibly boring. They're going to remember the dates and the names, and that's it. There's no narrative. So she said, if you're going to write it down in such a way that people enjoy reading it. Otherwise, it's all a waste of effort. So try to make it, you just mentioned narrative in the Chandi thing, the letter N, in a sort of narrative that is extremely accessible. And that's what the book is about. So what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about what was Majapahit, where was it, when was it? So time, location, get the basics right. We're going to talk about somebody whom I think deserves a lot of attention. His name is Kertanegara. And although most Indonesians know the big names of Majapahit, Gajah Mada, Hayam Buruk, Kertanegara is a bit on the outskirts, I would say. So we're going to talk about him because I actually think he's one of the most impressive persons in the whole story. And the funny thing is he wasn't even part of Majapahit, but he set the foundation for Majapahit. So we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about what Majapahit was, because although we call it an empire, it's an odd sort of empire. I call it a bit of a donut, and I'll explain later why that is the case. If people want to go into what are the sources, how do you make a story about Majapahit, we can do that as well. And what is Majapahit today? So we start off first with a timeline. There are basically four time zones I'd like to highlight. It starts actually very early in Kediri with a guy called Erlangga. After that, you have an empire called Singasari. Majapahit is then a separate empire, 1292, and it probably died in 1527. I'll tell you why I picked that particular date, but to be honest, after 1470, 1480, we don't really hear anything from Majapahit, so we don't know what was really there anymore. The reason why I start here is that at that particular point in time, a Balinese boy, Erlangga, had a kingdom and decided to separate, at the end of his life, to separate that kingdom into two parts. He wanted to retreat into the forest. He actually grew up in the forest, so a whole different story altogether. He retreated into the forest and said, my kingdom, I break it up into two parts. And that's Kediri, roughly speaking, and Malang, Singasari. Singasari is just on the outskirts of Malang now, and there's a mountain range in between. He did that, and with that, he set in motion a development that led to the rise of Majapahit. The way he did this is very important. At least the story goes something like this. He called in a man called Pubarata, who was a magician, who went to Bali to pick up magic water, Tirta, and he flew over the lands to make a magical division between, you could say, East and West Kediri and Singasari, so that was separated for the two sons. So there was a magical separation of the lands. Unfortunately for this magician, while he was flying, things went wrong. He flew into a tamarind tree. So he fell down on the ground and said, well, damn it, this tamarind tree. He could not finish his job. And he cursed the tamarind tree that it would never grow again. Now, we don't know what happened with the tamarind tree, but that place where he could not separate the lands is therefore also the place, and this is very important because it comes back, where you can unify the lands. This is a magical place. And I'll tell you where this place is. You can visit it. There's actually a Buddhist monastery right now. And I wonder if the Buddhists there realize what it really is. That place is called Wurare. I'll show you later what it is. So the magical separation, he couldn't do the separation. We'll get back to that. Anyway, you had East and West, Singasari, Kediri, the two places. And what happens in royal families, if you got two pieces of land, you fight. You fight about it because you want the other piece of land as well. And that's what they did as well. And for a long time, Kediri was on the upper hand, but eventually Singasari wins. This is in 1222. And the guy who did this is a nasty piece of work. He was basically a murderer, a robber, a rapist, and did anything what you could imagine what was not good. He betrayed his best friends. He lied and cheated his way through life. His name is Ken Arok. He had one big advantage over all of us. His father was Vishnu or Shiva or Brahmin, we don't really know, but any of these gods. So every time when he came into, he ran into problems and troubles, he was able to call his father and say, help me out. So at one point in time, the police was trying to catch him. He ran off. There was a river. He couldn't cross the river. He climbed a tree, in the tree, but the police spotted him. And instead of climbing the tree, they just started to axe it down. So he said, if the tree falls over, they're going to catch me and I'm going to be dead. But there you have Brahma or Shiva calling from the air, say, listen, take a couple of these leaves, just wave them, and you can fly. And he flew over the river and could run off again. This is very handy if you're a nasty sort of character and people don't like you, you can escape. That happened in 1222. He actually kills, murders, rapes his way into the top of Singasari and kills the head of the town and takes his wife. His wife was called Candedes, an incredible, beautiful woman. She has been described. All beauty salons in East Java are still called Candedes salon or something like that. So it's the beautification symbol. He takes her, and Candedes is a tragical sort of figure. She was already kidnapped by her first husband. Her first husband was then killed by Ken Arok, who became her second husband. She was pregnant of the first husband. We'll talk about the story in a second. And eventually, she had nothing to say in this whole particular process, but she took revenge, and I will talk about that a little bit later. Eventually, it becomes an absolute mess, and I'll talk about this mess, and a new king rises up, 1250, 1260, 1270, and this is Kertanegara. He pacifies the lands, he stabilized everything, and with him, Singasari rises, and there's clear evidence of this, and I'll show you some of this evidence as well. Then, something goes completely wrong. The Mongols invade, and Majapahit basically is built on the ashes of that war. You get the Majapahit Empire, and eventually the Islam states rise and run over it, and Majapahit is dead. And people ran off in all sorts of different directions, possibly even including Bali. So that's the timeline, so we know that. Where is Majapahit? Because there's no town called Majapahit if you look on the map. This is 14th century Southeast Asia. And this is where Majapahit is. So we're going to zoom in onto Majapahit. You can see Temasek, Singapore here, Malaysia. We got Sumatra here, Java, Majapahit, and Singasari there as well. So we zoom in on this area, close to Bali. So we have Majapahit right here. This is Surabaya here in East Java, and we zoom in a little bit further. Here we are. So Majapahit is right here. Kediri is here and Singasari is here. So those were the two capitals of the two pieces of land that Langa at one point in time wanted to separate. So if you're a magician that has been asked to make a separation and you go to Bali, get the water and fly over that land, where would you fly? You fly right here, next to the mountains. And where's this tamarind tree? It stands here. So this is the place where this tamarind tree stood, where this guy couldn't cause the actual separation, the magical separation of the lands. I'll get back to this area a little bit in a second, but also I want to highlight something else. You see a lot of temples here, and this is just the bigger temples. There are hundreds of other smaller temples, literally hundreds. It's all over the place. And if you are the minister of East Java culture or something like that, or the minister of Indonesian culture, what you want is one big massive temple. Majapahit was as big as Angkor, but Angkor's got Angkor Wat, the big temple. And there's nothing that Majapahit had. The thing is that they had hundreds of temples, but not real one big one. And I'll tell you later why I think this is the case. But there's a lot of temples, some of them small, some of them big. The most impressive one is Penataran. If you ever have time, you are in Malang or in Surabaya, it's a bit of a drive, but it's close to Blitar. Take a time and go to Penataran. After the Borobudur and Prambanan, I think is the third most impressive temple on Java. And that's up against some pretty high standards there. It's big, and I'll show you pictures of it later on. But we're going to zoom in on this area, Majapahit here. So it's actually close. You see a city here, Canggu, just quickly. There's a river, the Brantas River, that goes, funnily enough, around to Surabaya and here into the sea as well. But this place, Canggu, will come back, as will this place called Bubat. So we zoom in, and here we are, and this is the Majapahit Palace, right here at the bottom. What you see here is Bajang Ratu. That's a nice temple. We're not really going to talk about it, but it's become a symbol for Majapahit. And here we have this place called Vurare. There's a sleeping Buddha here now. That is the place of the tamarind tree where the magician was basically caught up in that tree. So Majapahit's location, the palace of it, is chosen for spiritual reasons. Most cities rise for economic reasons on the river. And actually there was a town there on the river that became quite big and powerful, Canggu. It is still part of Mojokerto today. But they were not, they were in the middle of basically nowhere, flattish lands over there. There was nothing too much, but that's where they built their temple. It's about a good, say, half, 3/4 of a day walk, if you don't have a meniscus problem, to the river. So it's a bit further off. But now we know what time we're talking about, and we know where this place is. Now we're going to go to the start of the story again. And every time we have a chapter in the presentation, we have this symbol that is on the Penataran temple. When they made temples in the Majapahit days, they had all sorts of stories. And if the stories went from one chapter to the other, they put a round symbol in it. It's quite nice. So I use that as well, as a separation. So we go here. We go to this Ken Arok guy, the murder, killer, rapist that wants power. So he's in Singasari, close to Malang, and he knows that there's this guy who runs the place. Not important what his name is, and he wants to take this guy out. He's very deceitful. He's got a friend of his actually doing it, but he wants his wife, Candelas, the beautiful lady. The books say that he saw her flaming thighs. So we don't know what flaming thighs is, but leave that up to your own imagination what it might be. He saw her flaming thighs and says, I need that woman. He killed the guy and became the head of that particular city. She was already pregnant of her first husband. So there was a bit of a problem here. And they decided not to tell the children that son number one, Anusapati, was actually the son of husband number one and not of husband number two, Ken Arok. So be it. He gets, we don't know how many children he had, probably 8 or 9, of which probably about 4 or 5 boys. When Anusapati is 20 years old, he goes to his mother, Candelas, says, listen, Dad is a bit different to me. He treats all the other guys differently than I. Always I'm the bad one. I always get poked upon, and there's what's going on here? And what does she do? She says, well, you're old enough now. I'll tell you a story. He's not your dad. Actually, your dad was husband number one. Your dad killed your father, your biological father. And yeah, sorry to tell you so, but if you want to do something about it, here's a knife. And she gives him a big kiss. He goes out and kills his father, Ken Arok. He then knows that his brothers, who are the real brothers of Ken Arok, they're going to go after him. So he builds a kind of a moat around his house. He's protecting himself, but he knows they're going to kill me eventually. It's just the risk you took. But he's worried about the afterlife because, yeah, your reincarnations, right? What if not only in this life they're going to go after you, but what in the future lives as well? So he had a temple raised, it's called Candi Kidal, with an outside sort of Kala head on top of it and dragons here to protect him in the afterlife. Now, we don't know what happened in the afterlife because I haven't been there yet. But he was eventually killed in this life by his brothers. And then it becomes absolutely messy because he is son number one. He gets killed by son number two. Son number two says, well, hey, you think that you are the big boss here now? I'm going to kill you. Son number three kills number two. Son number four says, well, you're the old generation. I am the younger guy here, and he kills number three. So for a period of about 20 years or so, it's murder and all these brothers killing each other. It's an absolute mess. And eventually one of the grandsons stands up and says, listen, this is a mess. Nobody takes us serious here anymore. So I'm going to make a rule. My son, a 5-year-old boy, he's the king. Of course, he wasn't really the king because his father was the king and he would rule as the king. Wisnuvardhana was his name. But he said, by the time I die, my son has been king for 20 years and I presume he will therefore be accepted as the real king. And this is how we get respect again. And he was right. It worked out because that little boy, 5 years old, became a king and his name is Kertanegara. And Kertanegara, was probably born 1250. So by 1270, he became the big king. He was 20 years old or so, and he ruled for quite a few years thereafter. 1292, he died. I'll talk about this in a second. But he stabilized the lands. And this is very important. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier on, Kertanegara is important for a couple of reasons. He was the real empire builder. First of all, because of the stability of the lands, we see a flourishing of the art. Because what we see is that on the statues, if there's stability in the land and the economy is growing and people make money, well, the arts flourish as well. And what we see is that certain motifs start to appear on the statues. This is a motif that was really important to them, for the kings. an interlocking circle sort of motif. Because if you had ceremonies as a king, well, there were all kinds of demons and ghosts coming in these ceremonies. You needed to protect yourself. So when you had a ceremony, you had a dress with these interlocking circles. And that was only for royalty. Now, take a bit of creativity, take two interlocking circles, stretch them out. You get an interlocking S. That's a batik. This is the very early start of what later, batik is a method, but the motifs of batik that, these interlocking brown and white sort of motifs that started to develop in the days of Singasari. Because we're not even in Majapahit yet. This is the days of Singasari. Also, what I think are some of the most beautiful statues the world has ever created is from those days. This is the Praja Paramita. It's in the National Museum in Jakarta now. It is an absolutely fabulous sort of statue. This goes up with the Romans and the Italians, and I'm not quite sure if the Dutch made any particular statue, but we were good at some point in time in paintings. But this is an absolute world-class piece of art. This statue. There are three of them. One is still outside of Malang. You can actually see it, and another one is in Sumatra, in Muara Jambi. But they're both headless. This is a full one. So the arts flourished. The economy was doing well. When Indonesia became independent, depending on who you ask, Dutch have a different date than the rest of the world. But let's say the Japanese came in the 1941. The Dutch were pushed out. The Japanese said to the Indonesians, rename your streets. So instead of street King Willem, it became Jalan Majapahit or something like that. When they had to pick the names for the biggest streets in Jakarta at the time, they picked the two names of the kings of Majapahit, Jalan Hayamburg and Jalan Gajah Mada. And this goes from Harmony in Jakarta up to Kota. So you've probably been there. Those were the big streets because the biggest kings get the biggest streets in those days. What streets did Kertanegara get? Some small outskirts on the Blok M, and the outskirts of Jakarta, literally in those days, was named Jalan Kertanegara. So at the time, in their imagination, it wasn't really a big king. He just got a side street. Actually, he gets a street the same size as Prapanca, a man we're going to take later on, who wrote a lot of history down in those days. The funny thing is that on this street, there are two important people now. One is a cat. It's called Bobby Kertanegara. And I'm in contact on Twitter with the cat. He responds. He's got a Twitter account. He lives in the palace because the other person that happens to be living here now is the President Prabowo. He lives on Jalan Kertanegara. That's where his house is. So funnily enough, by coincidence, this street is now back again. But you can see that in the imagination of Indonesia in the 1940s, Kertanegara didn't really play a big role. But I think he's incredibly important, and I'll tell you why. So, 1269. 1250 he became the king. 1269 is 20 years old. His father, his uncle died away. He's the king. He needs to make sure that people believe that he is the king. So what does he do? He does two things. The first thing he does, he calls in all the heads of the Buddha society and of the Hindu society, and those were the only two key religions around, and he says, listen, I want your full support. So no messing around. I'm the king, but in return, I will give you freedom. You can build whatever temple you want. There are a few temples that are royal temples. Penataran is one of them. I'll show you later. But the one that I showed you from Anusapati, the guy who in the afterlife was fearful that his brothers would come and kill him. Kidal is that particular temple. He says, that's mine as well. There's royal family. But for the rest, you're free to do whatever you want. Not only that, you get all sorts of tax benefits. You don't have to pay taxes on your land and stuff like that. We will not raise taxes there. Good for you. But you politically support me. And with that, he stabilized the lands and got domestic support. And he did that, I think, for a particular reason. And it's very important that he did that. And we know this in a inscription, Sarwadharma, it's called, 1269. This picture's got nothing to do with it, but it's just a nice picture that shows that maybe some people came together and these sort of things. We know from the inscription that he did that. And this is extremely important to figure out the date, 1269, 1270, give or take. Because there was something happening in the region, and Kertanegara was a guy who looked beyond Java. We go back to this map, of Southeast Asia in the 1270s, give or take. So there are Majapahit, we now know is here, and people came in this Canggu and in the Brantas River there that I showed you, a little bit half a day's north walk from Majapahit. People came there to trade. You had the Indians and the Tamils that came, Arabs. You had the Eastern Indonesians that came, and you had the Chinese that came there as well. They basically sailed to Surabaya, and from Surabaya you could follow the river. The river was extremely much wider than it is now, and still a wide river. And then you get to Canggu, and then it gets a bit more difficult, so that's where you stop, and that's where you trade. And if you want to pay homage to the king, you take a walk down to the palace, which is in a day's walk or so, spend the night there, back the next day, and there you go. So this was the trading center. But it was under threat. The Mongols, Kublai Khan, the Khan family was the Kublai Khan family was a family with enormous imperial ambitions, had run all the way to Eastern Europe and wanted to go south as well. So Kublai Khan was invading what is now Burma, northern Thailand, and Vietnam. It took him a lot of time, so multiple wars were fought in 1270, but somewhere in the 1270s he got control over Vietnam. And Kertanagara sits here, and he hears that from all kinds of merchants that arrive there. And he thinks, you know, if these guys go here and here, there's this place called Temasek, now called Singapore, that would be a nice place to set up a market, and we can get cut off. And if we get cut off, our economy is dead. We will become some impoverished, small kind of village, basically. So we need to protect ourselves against this threat, this Kublai Khan threat. And he does this in two ways. The first way is the military way. He invades. First, he invades Madura island, backwards from him a little bit, and he invades Bali. He doesn't want to be attacked in the rear. Having invaded Bali and Madura, he puts his navy in Tanjung Pura, Kalimantan, and in Sumatra. It's called Melayu at the time. So he's ready. He's got his army ready. He can control the waters here, and you need the control over the Strait of Malacca. So he's ready. So he says, you Mongols, you can come. Our military ready. But some disturbing news arrived in Singasari that apparently Kublai Khan was elevated to become something like a big Buddha. Through a special ceremony, he had become we don't have to go too technical about it, but became a sort of Buddha. And if you're a Buddha, well, you got all sorts of powers. You can do all sorts of things in wars. Get lightning and armies and winds and whatever. So he needed this as well. So he did this. He said, I need this as well. I need special spiritual powers to stand up against the Mongols or the Chinese, whatever you want to call it. And he did that. And the way to do this is depicted in this particular statue, which for a long time was in the Netherlands. I've seen it in the Netherlands, but it's now in Jakarta. The Dutch government, rightly so, has given it back. He did all sorts of tantric exercises, which includes, let's not go too deep into it, but basically drinking and dancing and singing and all sorts of other stuff that younger children should probably not be listening to yet. So he did all sorts of stuff in order to elevate powers and imbue these powers in these ceremonies in the middle of the night at cemeteries. You can see the cemetery here. Into statues. He imbued it into statues. Again, I'll leave it to your imagination how that exactly works. And then he placed these statues around the region. Now, one of these statues, I believe, is this one. There's a bit of a debate on what exactly the statue is. The museum says this is just a statue from Sumatra. But I think, given some particular sort of coincidences that they look a little bit together, I think this is a statue of Kertanagara, or a symbol of him. He imbued this statue. This statue is 7 meters tall. I mean, imagine the ships. They made it somewhere in Singasari, close to Malang, had to hoist it all the way to Tuban, which was the harbor, and then sail it all the way to Sumatra. And then it went another 300 kilometers up inland. That's where we found it. This thing is, I don't know how heavy it is, but it's a couple of tons or so, thousands of kilos, really heavy stuff, but it did it. He imbued that statue, and he therefore, by doing this in a couple of other places, built a spiritual halo around what we now can call Indonesia. Sumatra, Kalimantan, Java, Bali, all these places together. So he unified the lands. He needed to celebrate this. And where do you go to celebrate the unification of the lands? You go back to the tamarind tree in Burare. And that's exactly what he did. There was a big ceremony in 12 1289 in Bulgaria in November the 21st. We know this because there's a statue in Surabaya today that writes about this. If there ever needs to be a birth date of Indonesia, I think it should be the 21st of November 1289. Is the first time that Indonesia, as we know it, give or take, so much Eastern Indonesia yet, but for the first time comes together. This was his dream. So he was ready to take on the Chinese, spiritually and military. He's got his navy ready, and he had the spiritual powers to go for it. Fantastic. And he celebrated it. Now then things go really fast in Java. So he's got the 1289 ceremony. He is the big man of, let's call Indonesia at the time, ready to take it on. His navy and his armies are outside in Sumatra and Kalimantan. But something happens. A diplomat from China arrives and basically says to Kertanegara, listen, I'm from Kublai Khan, my master, you become a vassal. You just say you are part of our kingdom. You give me 2 parrots and maybe a couple of coconuts or something like that. I'll bring them back. I can say to Kublai Khan, you are part of our empire, and that's it. You can do whatever you want. You can tax people. You can do whatever you want. Freedom, but we just officially incorporate you into our empire, the Mongol Empire. Now, Kertanegara is a man, a strong-willed sort of man, who was ready to take on the Mongols, the Chinese, and was not ready to subject himself to Kublai Khan. So what does he do? He takes out a knife and cuts off the nose of the diplomat, Mengchi. In Indonesian history books, it's the ear, but I guess it doesn't really matter too much. So the guy goes either earless or noseless, goes back to Kublai Khan, says, well, listen, see what they've done to us. And Kublai Khan is absolutely furious. And he says, those Javanese over there, we're going to give them a damn good thrashing. Build me 2,000 ships, give me 3 admirals that can run it, sail over, take them all out, kill them. So, take some time to do that. You're going to build the ships and get the admirals and get all the people and stuff. So the Chinese are busy with that. Kertanegara must have known that this is going to happen. I mean, imagine Prabowo cutting off the nose of the American diplomat and sending him back to Trump. That will not go down very well in Washington. And this is the sort, he was the most powerful man on the planet, Kublai Khan. So he knew that Kublai Khan was going to come, but he was ready. Fine, bring it on. The problem now is that the people in Kadiri remember you had these 2 empires, Singasari and Kadiri, long time ago, but we're talking about 70 years ago when Ken Arok got them all together. The people in Kadiri said, you know, these people in Singasari, they always think they're the boss. They always think that they can do anything. But in the past, we were the leaders here. And by the way, Kertanegara's army is in Sumatra and Kalimantan. So domestically, he's weak. Let's go and attack the guy. And they split their army in 2. And part of the army goes around Blitar on the southern part very quietly, a stealth attack from the south. And then from the north, the king says, make as much noise as you make. And from the north goes the army, and it makes a lot of noise. And Kertanegara sits in his palace, and one of his advisors comes. He says, we are being attacked from the north by Kadiri. And he sends the guy back and says, are you nuts? This is my family, these people, of course they're not going to attack us. I'm much stronger. Stupid. He sends the guy back. The guy comes back. He says, no, we are under attack. I can see it in the red and white banners. This is the first time that Merah Putih, red and white, is being mentioned and became the colors of the Malay world eventually, and now the flag of Indonesia, but also Singapore and Malaysia. He gets attacked. And he realizes too late that he's strategically weak, that he is being attacked, but his army's not there. So what do you do if you're really into tantric stuff? You go to the ceremony, you start to drink, you start to sing, in the hope that some sort of halo comes around you and that you cannot be attacked. Unfortunately, either he was too late or didn't really work, but a spear killed him and he's dead. There's a story that he was involved with all kinds of ladies and stuff. But again, no need to go into those details. But he is dead. He is killed. And they burned the whole city of Singasari down. It is still underground, close to Malai. There's a hill. We know it is underground. Archaeologists are digging there. Wherever we dig, one of them told me, wherever we dig, we find stuff. The problem is a lot of people living on it, so you can't just chase them away. But it's still there. Singasari is fallen, Kertanegara is dead. By this time, the Mongol fleet with those 3 admirals is on its way to Java. There's an inscription in Vietnam that basically says, we saw this massive fleet coming from China, and thank God they didn't come for us, and we pray for the people that they're going to kill. Because they didn't know where they're going to, but we know how it sailed. It's actually in the book as a map, because it made stops and left inscriptions, and it ends up in Surabaya. Being in Surabaya, the 3 admirals get out of the boats, walk into the lands, say to some people, hey, where is Singasari and Kertanegara? We want to give this guy a damn good thrashing. They said, well, you're too late, because he's just been killed by one of his nephews from Kediri. That's where the king is now. The city is gone. So they're like, well, what do we do now? So, and we got to wait for 6 months, because you had to wait for the winds to move, right? Before you could sail back. So there you are. So they say, what do we do now? Now, out of nowhere, there's 2 characters, but I'll talk about one here, but the other one is in the book. Out of nowhere, the supposedly son-in-law of Kertanegara, a guy called Wijaya, Raden Wijaya, in English, Prince Wijaya, he comes up and he says to the Mongols, listen, my father-in-law, well, I haven't really married the daughters yet, so supposedly I was going to do that. So I was supposed to become the king. Now, my father-in-law has been killed by those nasty people in Kediri. I have a good deal for you. You help me to kill those people in Kediri, and I will submit myself to Kublai Khan. What about that? So the admiral said, well, you sailed all a long way. Kublai Khan doesn't really know the difference between Kediri and Singasari anyway. Let's do that. So they follow the Brantas River, attack Kediri, another big war. Kediri burned down. The king is killed. There's a whole story in it with some girls that later emerge and become very important. But Raden Wijaya had made that promise. So after the war, the Chinese go to Raden Wijaya and said, listen, you now have to submit yourself to Kublai Khan. And the guy says, I'll do that tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, nice ceremony, but tonight we party. We just won a war. So let's party. And they go and have a big party. So they party, very nice and well, they get drunk, but he tells his elite soldiers, you guys stay away from the alcohol. And somewhere around midnight or so, he brings in the soldiers and says, kill the Chinese or kill the Mongols, whoever they were. And they kill, and these Mongols and the admirals, they think, oh my God. And they run off. Yeah, imagine, it's all jungle, right? So they all run into different directions from what is now basically Jakarta. It's a big walk. It's about an hour's drive by car now. And they make their way eventually to Surabaya, are on the ships, say, what the hell are we doing here now? This place is hot. I don't like it here. We don't know this place. Let's go home. So they sail home with nothing to show for it. They get punished by Kublai Khan, although later he reinstalls 2 of the 3 admirals again. And there we are. Kertanegara dead. Singasari burned to the ground. Kediri burned to the ground. Raden Wijaya is now the new sort of guy, but he's got nowhere to live. So what does he do? He says, I'm going to build a palace where my father-in-law had the ceremony 2 years ago. It's only 2 years later. In Burare, where this tamarind tree presumably still stands. So he builds the palace there, and that's then where Majapahit starts. We're talking about 30 minutes now, and now only Majapahit starts. But in Majapahit, everything is in the run-up to Majapahit. And then Majapahit starts. Raden Wijaya is the king. There's another king that comes thereafter. He wasn't really liked too much, actually. They had a funny nickname for him. Basically, village idiot. He was called something like that. So they didn't like too much. But one of the daughters of Kertanegara is a girl named Gayatri. And Gayatri was a very young girl when the wars happened, when the Mongols invaded. She actually had to flee at one point in time when Kediri attacked her father. She fled and she became a domestic helper in a family in Kediri for a year, and nobody knew she was actually a princess. Eventually, she rises up and is being acknowledged. She goes and lives in the palace as well, and she's one of the wives of Raden Wijaya. Kertanegara looks like he had 4 daughters, and looks like they're all married with Raden Wijaya. He took them all just to make sure there was no other competition for them. So Raden Wijaya is the king. Then after you have another king that nobody likes. Gayatri doesn't like him either. But that king is not stable. And he relies on an army commander who's basically called Rutting Elephant. Rutting with an U, not an O. how would I say, very lustful elephant. His name is Gajah Mada. That's the translation of his name. He's an army commander, and he basically helps that king. But Gayatri at one point in time says, listen, I know you're very loyal to this king, but my father was Kertanegara. He unified this, let's call it Indonesia, this land. We need to bring that back. And he says, yeah, we need to do so. But he says, well, the current king is not really kind of a fan of this particular idea. He says, I'll take care of it. So he kills the king. Then in itself is a whole story with a dentist or a doctor. He kills the king, and Gayatri comes out supporting him, because he does it in such a way that it's not clear if he killed the king. It looked like the doctor did it. The doctor gets also killed by Gajah Mada, most likely. And when everybody says, well, Gajah Mada did this, Gayatri comes out and says, no, I don't believe that he did it. And provides support, and that suddenly elevates Gajah Mada. And his career is going like this. He was a sort of an army commander. He becomes a regional commander. And then 2 or 3 years later, he becomes basically the head of Majapahit. Gayatri puts her own daughter on the palace, who is pregnant, and gets a son, Hayam. So Gajah Mada was about 30 years old. Hayam was born. And that's the combo that really brings Majapahit to a sort of very great empire. One was young, but was older. Now, these are the dates. We've spoken about this. We can actually see how the invasion looked like. This is how a war looked like. This is depicted on some of the temples. This comes from Penataran temple. They had elephants, bedecked and stuff like that. They had carts, and it seems to be that you have feathers on your head during warfare. That's the latest fashion, I presume. But also, the Chinese ran away, but they left equipment behind them. What had the Chinese that the Javanese didn't have? Guns, cannons. They call them tsebbanga. This one is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I made a picture of it. Don't know how ever it got there, but they have it at the moment. So you have a lady that is supporting an army commander that have imperialist sort of ideas, and they got the latest military equipment as well. Now that's fantastic. And we now see that under Gajah Mada and Hayam, Majapahit really rises. He invades different places, and he proclaims in 1331, I will not do Palapa until I've unified all the lands. And he names all the lands from Irian Jaya to southern Thailand that he wants under his control. We still have no idea what Palapa means. He said, I will not do Palapa. It could be not drinking, maybe only eat vegetables, or we have no idea. We can't translate the word anymore. That meaning has lost. And of course, they go on to a building spree as well. So some of these temples are still there. This is a water sort of temple where they took a bath, and the royal family, and the water therefore became holy, and they went into the vineyards, the paddy fields on it. So the paddy fields were holy, and that was the only rice that the royal family was allowed to eat. This is how some people think Gajah Mada looked like. We have no idea how the guy looked like. It's a long time ago, no pictures around. But somebody declared that one of the sort of pictures that we of terracotta things we found that he looked like, he looks a bit like my nephew actually, Anur, who's about 30 years old and got this kind of chubby face as well. Well, maybe it is Gajah Mada, it doesn't matter. But this is what he says. This is then the empire that he proclaims. I will not do Palapa until I got everything under control. And they send their army here and there and there and there. And all these places submit themselves to Majapahit, with the exception of one. Pang, here, Sunda, West Java, not too far away. The Sundanese, not. Mountainous sort of region, difficult to get in. And this is a problem for Gajah Mada, because his life work is to bring everything together, but those damn Sundanese don't really want to play by his playbook. So he comes with a great idea. Hayam, this is 1360. Hayam is about 25, 26 years old. Everybody wants to marry the guy. And Gajah Mada says, why don't you marry with the daughter of the Sundanese king? And there we go. Then the Sundanese king is part of our empire. I'm happy, you're happy. Hayam says, okay, but I want to see a picture of her first. They actually send a guy there who makes a drawing. He says, oh, that looks pretty good. Okay, I'll marry her. And there's a wedding is being planned. That goes horrendously wrong because, and again, we have to be careful here, because the only scriptures that have been left over here are written by the Sundanese. So they're kind of biased in this particular story. But the Sundanese arrived. Basically, we're told by Gajah Mada that the princess would not be the queen, but a concubine. And Gajah Mada is being portrayed as a very rude man. He even says, "You rats, you weasels, you dogs, you eat shit, you go away." I'm not quite sure if he said all these things, but that's what the Sundanese wrote down to depict him as a real evil sort of guy. And the Sundanese are angry, Gajah Mada is angry, and these armies, they go and fight. And there's a war, the War of Bubat. Everybody's killed, including the king of the Sundanese, and the princess, who thought it was a wedding day. She got probably killed as well in the process. Again, we only know it from the Sundanese. Gajah Mada is being ousted out of the palace for some time. They don't like him, but they meet the guy. He's got the spies. He knows the administration. They bring him back in. But the question we then actually have to ask, Hayam Wuruk was 26 at the time. He was the king. He was the ultimate leader. Why didn't he do anything about this? Why did he let this happen? He didn't take any initiative. He liked dancing, we know, and he liked singing and probably eating and sleeping. But at crucial moments in history, we don't see Hayam Wuruk making right decisions. I think he was not a very strong character. He's oversold to a certain extent. Hayam Wuruk, when he eventually, then the lady was dead, so he had to marry somebody else. They found somebody else. He got married. He got a couple of women anyway, as it went in those days. Hayam Wuruk had to work hard as a king. Every year for 3 months, he went around part of his empire, so Central Java or Eastern Java or around Surabaya, for 3 months on a bull cart. He went from village to village because he needed to be seen. And that was tough travel in those days. We can see how that might have looked like. This is the picture from Penataran. This has got nothing to do with this. This is a princess and sort of kind of being carried around, but just an illustration how it looked. Some dogs would walk with them as well. So he had to work hard. He needed to be seen as the king to show that he was the legitimate king. And whole books have been written about where he might have traveled and these sort of things. And this is funny because while he had to try to work hard to get the loyalty of the people that were close to him, East Java, Central Java, in the outer regions, Kalimantan, Sumatra, Thailand, Malaysia, what it is now, Bali, they were actually quite happy to say, "Oh yeah, we're part of Majapahit," because that's where the money was. This is where the trade took place. So they were quite eager to join, to a certain extent, Majapahit. So is it an empire, or is it something that people said, "I would like to be part of"? I called it earlier on a donut. It seems that in the very core, the power was weak, but in the outskirts, the power was much stronger. Now, this Penataran temple was the state temple. He was probably coronated as king right here. Most probably, I think it actually happened here. We also know that this is a temple that he raised in Penataran because there's a date on it from his days. This temple is being moved, it's actually on top. You can see my wife here. She doesn't know this. I made this picture at 5 in the morning, and she didn't know I was making the picture. But anyway, it's a beautiful temple, Penataran. It's worth a visit if you ever go to Blitar or you're in those regions. And on Penataran, the royal family was only allowed to come here and climb this in the back. And the normal people were only allowed to come where I stand and make this picture here. And on the walls there's a sort of a small plateau. We can see life in the days of Majapahit. All sorts of depictions. So people here walking around, somebody sitting here, they got some, I don't know what it is, dogs, goats or something like that, birds flying around, all nice and short pictures. But we also see the latest sort of Netflix on being depicted there as well. Netflix series. The big story that people told each other over the fire or something in the evenings was the so-called Panji story. The Panji story is very simple. You got a prince called Panji. He's got a princess, he wants to marry her, she's been kidnapped, so away, he's got to look for her, he eventually finds her, and he marries her, happy after. But there's a lot of adventures he has, and he's got a lot of girlfriends. We're talking hundreds of girlfriends in this whole process. Here he's having an intimate moment with one of them, here's got an even more intimate moment with another one, and here we see probably the earliest depiction of a gamelan. He liked music, so we see depiction of music instruments here as well. This is important because these Panji stories were not only told between the Majapahit people, but also the Arabs heard these stories and people from Malaysia and Thailand. My colleagues, I tested this in Bangkok. I said, "Have you ever heard of my Panji?" I said, "No, never heard of it, never heard of it." Javanese story, never heard of it. Then I realized that in Thai, it's called Inau. My Thai is really bad, so Inau, I think it is. And then I said, do you know Inau? And he said, of course, Inau, everybody knows Inau. Inau is if you're 10 years old, you do a school play, you play an Inau play. And Inau is the Panji play. So these Panji cultural stories from Majapahit went to Thailand. Not only that, if you ever go to Bangkok and you see those palaces there, their murals, the Panji plays are being depicted there. They're on the walls. This is Majapahit stories in Bangkok. You can see them even today. Now, Gajah Mada dies, 1280. He's the strong guy. Hayam Wuruk is then the king and needs to run it. And he can't. As soon as Gajah Mada dies, Hayam Wuruk tries to keep things together, probably for another 5, 6, 7 years. But things fall apart. We can see this in letters. The king of Brunei sends a letter to China. He says, listen, we have to send thousands of camphor trees. That was the kind of luxury product in those days. Thousands of camphor trees we have to send every year to Majapahit. We are more than willing to send it to you in Beijing, if only on the condition you can tell Majapahit that you and I now have a deal. So they tried to behind China. And China, and actually Sumatra does this as well, and China makes a mistake. It actually contacts Sumatra. Hayam Wuruk hears about it and sends a letter to Beijing, say, hey, this is my territory. And the Chinese back off. Say, sorry. I don't think it was a mistake. They did it on purpose, just to test the water probably, but they back off. But Hayam Wuruk dies. And we see that suddenly everything changes. Indonesia sometimes has, like all other countries, a problem with historical amnesia. We forget things. We forget history. Hayam Wuruk also forgets something, because what does he do at the moment he dies? He separates his land into two, into Singasari and Kediri. The very thing that Erlanger did a couple of 100 years ago, and that became such a mess. So he separates his land between a daughter and a son, and what do? They start to fight about it. And what do the Chinese do? They come in and they help them both. Oh, we can help you with weapons. Oh, we can help you with weapons as well. And they let them fight. So only a couple of years after Hayam Wuruk's death, we see that China becomes much more invasive and tries to break him up. There are actually records that hundreds of Chinese died in just across the water here, not far from Banyuwangi. They were there. What were they doing there? You would wonder. Anyway, Majapahit falls apart. There's a civil war. There is even a record that in 1415, there's a famine in Java. How can you have a famine in a place as fertile as this? It must be that the government had lost control, canals were not being repaired, farmers were used in wars. It was a complete mess. And what happens, and maybe this is also sort of constant in Indonesian history, it's the women that pick it up. Gayatri was the woman that picked up earlier. Candedes was a woman that took kind of revenge in her own way. And there's another lady called Suhita. She steps in and she tries to bring the land together again. She's strong-willed. There's a nice statue of her in Jakarta. She's kind of a small lady. I think she's about this size or so. Like a lot of jewelry. There's a lot of jewelry over it, more than normal even. She tries to pull it together. At least that's what we think are in the inscriptions. But when she then dies, it all falls apart. And now we're talking about Hayam Wuruk died 1380, or Gajah Mada died in 1380, Hayam Wuruk close to 1400. She was there from 1400, 30, 40. We see that the Chinese are in everywhere. It all starts to fall apart. And actually from 1470, we don't really have any evidence that Majapahit is there anymore. There is a sort of mythical story that says that by 1527, so you're talking 150 years later, that the Islam states on the north of Java, they attack Majapahit. And that is then the end of it. And that's the date I give in the beginning, 1527, because it's a beautiful date, if you like stories like I do, because that army that supposedly from Demak, a Muslim state, attacked Majapahit, presumably in the beginning of the year, they attacked another city in West Java called Banten later in the year. And on their way back, they took a small town with lanky palm trees called Kelapa, and they renamed it to the victory that they had, Jakarta. So the birth of Jakarta was in the same year as the death of Majapahit. It's gone. Raffles hears about it, doesn't know what it is, goes around, finds some temples here and there. He looks for Majapahit. We now know how Raffles traveled. At one point in time, he was on the road. If he would have gone right, he would have hit some big temples. but he went left, so he missed them all. So he thought in the end, there's nothing Majapahit, can't believe what it is. And actually for a long time, people weren't quite sure if there was a myth or a story or anything at all. Now, very quickly, there was another character they haven't inserted yet. When Hayam Wuruk made his rounds across East Java, he had all sorts of people, of course, traveling with him, doctors and cooks and whatever. But there was also a guy, a scribe, a writer. He was the son of the head of the Buddhist community. His name is Prapanca. And he's famous in Indonesia because he wrote down a book about his travels. And his book, actually at the end of his book, he says, I think it's going to be a failure. Nobody likes my book. Because in those days, the books that people liked was like princess, king, dragons, fighting. But he wrote a book, on Monday, we went to place A. We slept in place A, and then on Tuesday, we went to place B. We ate in place B, and we slept in place B. On Wednesday, we went to place C. And he writes it all down. It's incredibly boring parts of it. But he describes also the cities. It's a bit more lively than I depicted here. And he writes it down. And it's all scribbled down on leaves. And in the end of his life, he calls it the Negara Kertagama. Actually, he calls it different. He calls it the depiction of the villages in the lands, Desa Varnana. But eventually it was called the Negara Kertagama, the land, the description of the land and the law. And it ends up in the library. When Demak then attacks Majapahit at the very end, everything is burned down, but some people must have taken all the books from the library and brought it somewhere. Probably to Bali. Yeah. And the Balinese read it and said, hey, these are people that we know. We're going to copy this book, because if you didn't copy it, then, well, it would be lost. So he copied, the people copied the book, and somehow that book ended up in Lombok, because the Balinese were in Lombok as well, in 1893. And the Dutch were there as well. They wanted control over Lombok. They fought some war in Aceh and had killed a lot of people there. So they said, well, we're going to do this in Lombok now. So there's a big war in Jakarta in Lombok, 1894, against the Balinese who were there. So they said they were helping the Lombokese, the Sasak, but that wasn't really the case, but it doesn't matter too much. The Dutch win, and they burned down the Balinese palace in Lombok. But there's one soldier who is a language specialist. He goes into the library and he grabs books with him. And he brings them to Batavia, to Jakarta, and he starts to translate them. He's an expert in Sanskrit and Kali, the old language. And he finds this book from Prapanca with the depiction of Majapahit and all the cities and the temples and what they lived and the sort of parties that they have and all these sort of things. So suddenly it comes to life, and there's a realization. This is around 1900 when the book is being published. The guy's called Brandes. And there's a realization this place is real. So the Dutch Archaeological Institution has a big fight internally about who is going to dig it all up, and they dig it all up, but they don't know where it is. So for about 30, 40 years, they dig up places, they find all the temples, but they don't know where the palace of Majapahit is. And there's even a story, somebody said, maybe there wasn't a palace, maybe it didn't even exist. Until in 1940, Stotterheim, funny name, Dutch name, he's the head of the archaeological department, and he's an absolute expert in Javanese and Balinese temples. And with his knowledge and the Prapanca book, he walks the lands and he says, I think I know where it is. And he writes a book about it, the Majapahit Palace. That's the title of the book. And he wants to publish it. But the Dutch government says no. 1941. The last thing they want is some Dutch guy writing about how fantastic the Indonesians had an empire a long time ago, just when the nationalists were coming up and Sukarno and these sort of things. So they forbid him to publish the book. He tries to publish it, and it's very funny. It's only, I think there's only a Dutch copy. The first page says, I've tried to look for the palace of Majapahit. I've come to the conclusion that we cannot identify where this is. It is impossible to know where the palace is. Maybe it didn't even exist. That's it. And then he has 300 pages with all the evidence. He hoped that the Dutch officials would open up the book and say, well, it's okay, we can publish this. But it didn't work out. He died. The book was later published. And he found the place where we now have Majapahit. So that's why we now know where it is. I'm not going to go into this. We can do that over the Q&A. I've probably run over my time quite significantly already. And what is Majapahit today? It is still, to a certain extent, it's still around us in the color of the flag, in the murals in Bangkok, in the ceremonies that of course you see here. A lot of that are linked to those days. But also, and I think this is what I in particular say if I do presentations outside of Indonesia, Majapahit was a place whereby in the scripture we cannot see that they were divisive. There were Tamil, Arabs, Persians, Chinese, Mongols, Javanese, Balinese, people from Eastern Indonesia, maybe even Australians, Aboriginals there. There's a depiction of people who were really black. They say we don't know where they come from, but it might have been Aboriginals, people from Sumatra. And they love that diversity. They literally celebrate. They believe that progress came from diversity and they envisaged that. They wrote it down. This is now the motto of the Indonesian emblem. It says unity in diversity. It's something that they actually revered. And we see this in these Panji stories to a certain extent as well. And maybe the biggest heritage that Majapahit has given us is that is something that actually Indonesia can bring to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world has a problem with diversity these days and a problem with religions and different people. But in those days, and maybe even now in Indonesia, it's something that can still unite them. Excuses for running seriously over time, but that is the story of Majapahit. Thank you very much.